Today we'll be talking about Chapter 10, Section 2, and the title of this is Protest, Resistance, and Violence. We're going to be talking about, again, the politics of slavery, but it's more than just a political disagreement. People began killing one another over this issue even prior to the American Civil War. And so we're going to talk about some of these instances of violence leading up to the American Civil War. First off, I wanted to show you a map of the Underground Railroad. Now, I don't know if you're like me. When I was a kid, I thought this was an actual railroad. I went to Disney World looking for an exhibit of the Underground Railroad. I remember going to the Tom Sawyer. I know they don't have this exhibit anymore, but they used to have a Huck Finn exhibit. It was really cool, like a big giant tree house, and there was a pretend Underground Railroad. And I thought, oh, cool, there's going to be a neat tunnel. And nope, it's just a network of people. I'm like, what? Well, anyway, I was a little disappointed as a kid. But I think it's fascinating as an adult how there was this secret network of people providing safe houses for escaping slaves. There were people in the South as well as in the North helping others escape from slavery. And so they were helping one another to escape. The Compromise of 1850 mandated that northern states were required by federal law to turn in escaped slaves. This was known as the Fugitive Slave Act. This was the part of the Compromise of 1850 that eventually helped the South to give in to the idea of California being a free state. But it had very harsh terms. Any alleged fugitive. Now that's the trick there, any alleged fugitive. Well, how do you determine if someone is an alleged fugitive? Simply by the color of their skin. So really any black person could be accused of being an escaped slave. These alleged fugitives were denied a trial by jury. They were denied the right to testify on their own behalf. I don't know if you've seen the movie 12 Years a Slave. Solomon Northrop, true story, was kidnapped. He was not an escaped slave. He was kidnapped, and he was sold into slavery. And the Fugitive Slave Act made this possible. He was not allowed to testify on his own behalf. In fact, the judge received more money for selling him into slavery than he would have received if he had ruled in Solomon Northrop's favor. People could be convicted of helping escaped fugitives. And so that made members of the Underground Railroad criminals. Can you imagine? This takes civil disobedience to a whole new level. Harriet Tubman, that we now celebrate as a hero, was a wanted fugitive. There was a price on her head in the South, and she would have been convicted as a criminal under United States law under the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, as you can imagine, a number of people were upset about this law. A number of people openly defied this law. In fact, some states began to pass personal liberty laws openly defying this law. Some Northerners within the Underground Railroad began to help slaves escape to Canada.
Some of the abolitionists established what was called the Underground Railroad. It was not underground, nor was it a railroad. It consisted of groups of people who worked together to secretly escort Southern slaves from the South to freedom in the North. Harriet Tubman, an escaped slave, was a guide or conductor on the Underground Railroad. During the 1850s, she made 19 trips from the South to the North, leading more than 300 people to freedom. One abolitionist, John Brown, had a plan to give guns to slaves so they could fight for their freedom. He and a small group of followers seized a weapons storehouse in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. His plan failed when local militia and federal troops stopped them. Some slaves, such as Nat Turner, started uprisings on their own, but these also failed. The Civil War had many causes. There were the economic issues of tariffs and northern control of railroads and banks. Political issues of states' rights and who controlled the Congress, and the heated issue of slavery. As the presidential election of 1860 approached, Southerners feared losing control to a Northerner.
I wanted to give you a little information about Harriet Tubman. She herself had escaped from slavery, but not before being injured. Her owner hit her upside the head with a lead weight, causing traumatic brain damage. In fact, this caused her to pass out several times during the day. She never fully recovered from those injuries she sustained from her owner. Yet, despite her disability, she made multiple trips down to the South to help others escape. And she once said, "I freed 1,000 slaves. I could have freed 1,000 more if only they knew they were slaves." Because you see, one of the troubles that she had was actually convincing others to escape, because escaping was a life-threatening and sometimes fatal undertaking. You see, the Underground Railroad was a secret network of people helping slaves to escape. And despite this network, sometimes slaves were caught and they suffered violent fates. These fugitives would usually go away from their plantations at night. They would often have to go with what they had and what they could carry, and there would often be posses sent out to look for them. As I said, if they were caught, they could be killed on sight, or in some cases they were brought back to their plantations. I've read of horrible fates that befell these slaves. In some cases they were kneecapped, meaning they would have their legs broken. In some cases they would be hung in front of the rest of the slaves. I even read of a case where slaves were burned at the stake to make an example of. A young 14-year-old girl wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe. I've already told you about the book a little. The main theme of this book was that it showed slavery to be a moral and personal issue, that it made it real for many. Even abolitionists in the North, who were already convinced that slavery was wrong, saw it for the first time as an issue affecting people personally. Sometimes you have to see a thing for yourself before you can really understand it. And sometimes, as they say, it ain't real till it's real. Well, that's what Uncle Tom's Cabin did for many Americans, was it made the issue of slavery real. A little about Harriet Beecher Stowe. She went on to meet Abraham Lincoln before his assassination. And this is what Lincoln said to her: "So, you're the little lady who wrote this book that started the big war." Can you imagine having such a profound impact? John Brown, with his desperate actions. Harriet Tubman, with her heroism. Frederick Douglass, with his peaceful political attempts. And William Lloyd Garrison. All of these individuals have been working throughout their careers to either end slavery or to start the war that would end slavery. Yet it was a 14-year-old girl who got people thinking with a story. It's powerful what an impact a story can have.
Perhaps the single most important cause of the American Civil War was the issue of slavery. The North and South held opposing views on slavery. Many in the free northern states wanted to contain slavery and prevent any new states from becoming slave states. But Southerners felt it was their constitutional right to own slaves. The Southern economy depended on slave labor to grow cotton, which it sold to textile mills in Britain and in the North. The cotton gin had led to the spread of cotton growing in the South and to the spread of slavery. Some Americans, the abolitionists, argued loudly that slavery should be ended. They made speeches and wrote articles and books saying that slavery was immoral. They denounced the Fugitive Slave Act, which allowed officials to arrest any African American suspected of being a runaway slave. The writer Harriet Beecher Stowe was the daughter of an abolitionist minister in Cincinnati, Ohio. Stowe lived along the Ohio River, a border between slavery in Kentucky and freedom in Ohio. She often visited plantations in Kentucky, and she grew deeply troubled by the miserable conditions in which slaves lived and the injustice of slavery itself. She witnessed the back-breaking labor of the slaves as well as the brutal way their owners treated them. Spurred to action, Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel about a runaway slave who is eventually captured and sold back into slavery. Stowe depicted the cruelty of slave owners and the humanity of slaves. Many readers were stunned by the book's graphic descriptions of the harsh treatment of slaves. The book became an instant bestseller and highlighted the issue as a moral question of right versus wrong. Before Uncle Tom's Cabin was published, many Northerners had been unconcerned about slavery. But now many people viewed Stowe's book as evidence of slavery's immorality. Southerners called the book propaganda, claiming it did not describe slavery and slave owners fairly. They grew more suspicious of the North because they felt their rights and their way of life were under attack. Southerners wondered how their economy could survive without slaves, and why Northerners wanted to take away their rights. The tension between the two sections continued to grow, fed by fighting between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces in Kansas. The nation, it seemed, was heading toward war. In 1861, after the election of Abraham Lincoln, that war finally broke out. Several Southern states left the Union to create their own nation, and North and South formed armies that fought each other. Harriet Beecher Stowe's powerful book had played a part in readying people in the North for that war.
Now, as I've told you many times, people are working desperately to solve the crisis, to reunite our country, to end slavery by peaceful means. Perhaps one of the more clever ideas, aside from outlawing slavery altogether, was that of Stephen Douglas. Douglas believed that territories would naturally be incorporated into the Union as states as the population of the Western territories expanded. Which he was right, obviously. We now have 50 states, many of them in the West. He wanted a railroad going west from Chicago. It would eventually connect the two oceans. Again, that would be achieved in the 1870s, the Transcontinental Railroad. He believed that westward expansion would actually help the Democratic Party because the Democrats tend to represent rural farmers at this time. They tend to be popular among the poor. And so as farmers moved westward, that would grow the Democratic Party. And so he felt that Southerners, who were exclusively Democrats at this time, would acquiesce to the idea of westward expansion. Now, he felt that popular sovereignty would be the best way to organize the new states. California, after all, decided to be a free state. It was their choice, supported by President Zachary Taylor. And Douglas believed that popular sovereignty was impractical in Western farms. He believed that slavery would grow obsolete because, with mechanization of farming, machines would replace many farm hands, both in the North and the South. But he also believed that the climate of the West was not conducive to cash crops like tobacco, particularly cotton, sugar, or rice. And so, like the North, our country would eventually outlaw slavery. Douglas's plan was not just theoretical. He hoped to put it into practice. He believed that popular sovereignty would eventually fix the issue of slavery. Meanwhile, the Missouri Compromise had outlawed slavery north of the Mason-Dixon line, also known as the 3630 parallel. It's a line of longitude. Here you see the old division between the North and the South. That's called the Mason-Dixon line. That was defined by the Missouri Compromise. Now, Douglas hoped to revise that old compromise from 1820. Because after all, he wanted territories to be able to vote on the issue of slavery within their own respective territory. It's a great idea in theory. However, Abraham Lincoln is going to vehemently disagree with Douglas's ideas for reasons that I do applaud him for that we'll look at in just a moment. But nonetheless, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was going to allow popular sovereignty on the issue of slavery in the territories. Now, when popular sovereignty is going to be the deciding factor on an issue such as slavery, it's going to be a difficult one. See, voting fraud was not uncommon at this time. And the vote over slavery in Kansas is one of the greatest instances of voter fraud in American history. John Brown is going to come into play as a major character that we'll see in just a moment.
Emotions on both sides of the slavery issue once again rose in 1854 when a bill called the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed Congress. This bill repealed the Missouri Compromise and allowed residents of Kansas and Nebraska to decide for themselves whether or not slavery would be allowed in their states. The result of this unfortunate law was that settlers who strongly favored slavery and settlers who hated slavery both immigrated to Kansas. When these groups came into contact with each other, much fighting and killing resulted. Kansas was often referred to as Bleeding Kansas.
So, Bleeding Kansas. The vote over the issue of slavery in the Kansas-Nebraska territories turned into violence. It is a wonderful thing in this country that we have peaceful transitions of power. In fact, until the creation of the United States, that was a rather rare occurrence. Typically, transitions of power resulted in what we saw in Libya during the Arab Spring in 2012, where Omar Gaddafi was stabbed to death by an angry mob. That's the more common occurrence of transitions of power, at least up until the creation of the United States. Votes don't often go down so well, as was the case in 1854 in the Kansas-Nebraska territories. Settlers poured into Kansas, poured into Nebraska, simply to vote, and then they would leave. Voting records show that dead people were voting in this election. I'm not saying zombies rose from the grave. I'm saying that people reported their names as the names of the deceased so that they could vote multiple times. There were instances of people wearing fake beards and disguises and then going to vote multiple times and then taking the disguise off and voting again. Every instance of voter fraud you can think of occurred during this vote on the issue of slavery in the Kansas-Nebraska territories. In fact, more people voted for slavery in the Kansas-Nebraska territory than the population of the Kansas-Nebraska territory. That means more people voted than would be humanly possible. Again, the most fraudulent election in history, at least in the history of our country. Now, this vote went down very badly. In fact, the anti-slavery group refused to recognize the results of the election. I don't blame them, right? It was obviously a fake. And so they set up an anti-slavery capital of Kansas at Topeka, which is currently the capital of Kansas. And then a pro-slavery government was set up at Lecompton. And so you have two capitals of one state, and each capital has declared the other null and void. It's kind of like there was a case in history where we had two popes. You ever heard that story? Yeah, we once had two popes, and both popes excommunicated one another. They said, you go to hell. No, you go to hell. We're both going to hell, whatever. We had two popes that didn't go so well. We had two capitals of one state. Now, the pro-slavery capital sent a mob of 800 people to burn down the capital of the anti-slavery people. That's known as the Sack of Lawrence. So here's a charcoal engraving of the time. This was all over newspapers. Can you imagine? I know you're like, oh, that was whatever, long ago. It's not that exciting. Can you imagine if something like this happened today? If we had a vote, it was clearly a fraud, and then people, imagine, okay, so we have the presidential election. Let's say that one of the people loses. Let's say one of them loses. Now, let's say that same individual rounds up an angry mob, which I'm concerned about the potential of that happening.
I actually think that might happen.
I am honestly concerned about the potential of that happening. The loser rounds up an angry mob and starts setting towns on fire.
Yep.
Again, I'm just letting you know these things have happened before. Yeah, so I'm just letting you know it's happened before. In fact, in the case of Kansas, there were 200 deaths after this election. Once again, can you imagine? 2016, the election goes down, 200 people dead after the election. Oh my gosh, right? We'd have Britain coming back to try to send peacekeeping forces over here. Saying, okay, we screwed up. We shouldn't have given you your independence. We're taking that back now. So here comes John Brown. John Brown believed that slavery would not end but for violent means. Brown sent his followers to the pro-slavery capital at Potawatomi, Kansas. And he found the first 5 men on the street, and he killed them in cold blood, and he cut their hands off and put them on spears in front of the town. That's the very same man that you're writing about on whether or not he was a terrorist. By the way, before you dismiss him as insane, Harriet Tubman was working with his cause. She was aware of the Harper's Ferry incident prior to its occurrence. She probably would have helped had she could, but her health prevented her from being involved in the Harper's Ferry raid. So I just want to let you know he had some powerful friends. Now, why did Brown do this? Well, like any other violent political action, Brown hoped to start a fight. Well, what better way to start a fight than by going in and killing people and then pinning it on the anti-slavery party, which is exactly what he did. And did he start a fight? Oh, yeah, he started a fight. And, in fact, the fight led to the deaths of 200 people. Charles Manson would have been proud. Now, I bring up Charles Manson because, again, while, okay, I'm going to go ahead and say Manson was a lunatic, but his purpose was to start a fight. He wanted to start a race war in the 1960s. And so he would kill white women and blame it on black people. And he would kill black people and blame it on the police. Can you imagine if somebody started doing that today? Okay. Now, meanwhile, you might think, well, okay, what's going on in the political front? Maybe they're just talking about these things. Maybe the Frederick Douglasses of the world are going to tell people to chill out. Maybe the Henry Clays are going to make peace. Oh, no. At this point, I mean, we're in the late 1850s. Charles Sumner, senator from the North, went on just one of the most famous political rants in American history. He went on for several days just calling the South a bunch of redneck, hick, slave-owning people. And he went on for days talking about how the South was backward, how we were the laughing stock of the free world, how we would dare to say that all men are created equal, and then go on to enslave others. The audacity, the barbarism of the South for doing such a thing. And then Senator from South Carolina. It's always South Carolina, by the way. Anyway, Senator from South Carolina, Preston Brooks, in the Senate, which you'll get to go there someday. Go on the D.C. trip. You'll get to see it. In the Senate, goes up to Charles Sumner. And he says, and I quote, "Mr. Sumner, your comments are liable to my people and a personal attack upon my family." And then he proceeds to pull out a cane and beat Sumner half to death within the halls of the Senate. This was known as the caning of Charles Sumner. In the Senate, a fight broke out because of slavery. Charles Sumner sustained multiple contusions to the head, upon which he never recovered. In fact, he would later die of a stroke as a result of his injuries.
I don't know